Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Michelle Mills, President and CEO of the Better Business Bureau in Central East Texas. We are so grateful to all of you who are joining us today. Please submit your questions in the question panel and we will get to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. So if you're here today, it feels like the economy is being slammed from all directions. The pandemic, inflation, supply chain issues, worker shortages, energy price hikes, interest rate increases, and all of these things and more have presented us with ongoing challenges which can make it difficult to make confident decisions for our organizations. So if you can relate to any of this, then we're really glad that you are here today. Our presenter today is Dr. Ray Perryman, CEO of the Perryman Group. Dr. Perryman does our economic update for our area, and he talks about what's happening all over the U.S., but what has been really helpful to us here in our decision making is that he really breaks it down to the Texas economy and even further, more specifically to East Texas. So I've been going to his presentations for the last 12, 13 years, and they've been great. And I'm a PR major, and he breaks it down to where I actually really enjoy it, and it's been very, very helpful. So Dr. Perryman holds a BS in mathematics from Baylor University, SICM, and a PhD in economics from Rice University. Dr. Perryman has received citations from governments all around the world, presidents, governors, Congress, and national and state administrative and legislative bodies. He has been nominated for the Bank of Sweden Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. His firm has served the needs of more than 2,500 clients, including 2/3 of the Global 25, over half of the Fortune 100, the 12 largest technology firms in the world, 10 U.S. cabinet departments, and 9 firms in the U.S., the 6 largest energy companies operating in the U.S., and the 5 largest U.S. banking institutions. He has been described as a genius by the Wall Street Journal, a world-class scholar by Business Week, and the most quoted man in Texas by Texas Monthly. Dr. Perryman writes a weekly syndicated newspaper column, hosts a daily radio commentary, and appears regularly on NPR and has earned the title the state's premier barbecue connoisseur by the Dallas Morning News. So Dr. Perryman, thank you and welcome. When we get offline, I'd love to hear more about your favorite barbecue spots. We love barbecue. And in the meantime, I will let you take it from here.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here today and to spend a few minutes with all of you. And I appreciate the kind words. I appreciate the introduction. I have been very fortunate over the course of my career, and a lot of people said a lot of nice things. Some have said some not so nice things, as you would expect. And it's been all over the map, and I have been awarded a number of nice things, and people have been very kind. One that stuck out with me was the little town I grew up in, which is only 12 miles from where Michelle is, over in East Texas, started a Distinguished Alumni Award a few years ago, and they were kind enough to give it to me. And I went over there and spent a few days. I had not spent a lot of time there in the last few years, saw a lot of old friends. And when my wife asked me what it was like growing up in a town that small, first I told her it was great. And she said, well, what was your biggest challenge? And I said, well, I think the biggest challenge was we were so small, we had to take driver's education and sex education in the same car. And her response was, that makes perfect sense. You can't drive either. I get those kind of remarks from her fairly often. I remember one time years ago, I bought her a really nice mink coat for an occasion. And one of her friends said, isn't it amazing that something so beautiful can come from such a weaselly, ugly, beady-eyed little ferret? And her response was, yeah, but he's nice to the kids. So I hope you're laughing at some of this. This is one thing I don't like about Zooms, is I never know what the response is on the other end. I did have someone come up to me not long ago and say that they really appreciated my self-deprecating humor. And so with that, I told them that, as an economist for the last 40 plus years, I've been stinking up a lot of rooms. So I thought that was entirely appropriate. What I'm going to try to do today is there is a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos out there, and a lot of people are wondering what the heck's going on. I've been doing this well over 40 years. I'm a student of it well over a number of centuries and even millennia. And this is one of those times, one of the most unusual times that we've ever confronted in terms of so many different things happening. And you hear conflicting things on the news all the time and conflicting things from the politicians. And I'm going to try to just kind of peel back the onion a couple of layers and explain some of these things, hopefully in a way that makes a little bit more sense to you and will help you kind of figure out what's going on and how to maybe cope with it a little bit better. That's what I'm going to try to accomplish today as we spend a few minutes together. I will tell you in advance one policy I've had for the last 40 plus years, which has made my life very interesting, is our firm does a large, huge numbers of studies. We've done thousands of studies over the years, and we just report the results. And sometimes the Democrats like them, and sometimes the Republicans like them, and so on. So I will probably offend all of you at some point today, and hopefully all of you will like something I say today. But that's kind of the way it goes. Just a couple of months ago, I was testifying down to the legislature in Austin about an issue, and got a question, and the way I answered it was something that the Democrats didn't like. And at the same moment, my company was releasing a study on the issues down on the border that was something the Republicans didn't like. And one columnist noticed it, wrote a column, I think it was in the Corpus Christi paper, and then went a few other places. They called me an equal opportunity offender. And so I'm going to try to live up to that as we go through this today. But let's try to break this thing down a little bit and kind of and give you some perspective. First of all, I certainly don't want to dwell on the pandemic, but I think we have to understand what the pandemic did in order to kind of get a handle on what's going on now, because a lot of what's happening now is still fallout from what happened in the pandemic. The first thing I would say about it is it was extremely atypical. This is normally not what happens in our economy. We were on an 11-year growth spurt. It was the longest in history, and it was bipartisan. About 2/3 of it was in the Obama administration, and a third of it was in the Trump administration. And we had our fits and starts, but we were rocking along, and it still had some legs. I mean, economic expansions usually don't die of old age. We weren't doing anything to really knock ourselves off course or anything, and this just hit like a bolt of lightning out of nowhere. Normally, when we have a recession, it's our fault. As I say, recoveries don't die of old age. It's usually we do something we shouldn't have done. The Great Recession, as we used to call it back in 2008, with the mortgage crisis, we brought that on ourselves with mortgage lending policies. The one before that, we brought on ourselves with going crazy over .com stocks. We had another one over the way we did our bookkeeping. We had one over syndications. But it's normally when we kind of get carried away in something and create a bubble, and then that bubble bursts and we have to deal with it. This one was something completely different. It was something that came completely from the outside and caught us totally flat-footed. And that was one thing that was unusual about it. The other thing was just how severe it was and how quickly it came on us. And even though we've lived it fairly recently, it's hard to get your arms around that to some extent. Let me kind of give you a little bit of perspective here. The Great Recession, which at the time, back in 2008, 2009, at the time was the worst thing we'd experienced since the Great Depression. We lost 9.4 million jobs in 14 months. So you're talking 600,000-700,000 jobs a month. I mean, it was a devastating time, but 9.4 million jobs in 14 months. This time we lost 22 million jobs in 2 months. So it was literally 2.5 times as many jobs in 1/7 the time. We lost over 20 million jobs in April of 2020 alone. And that, we just haven't seen anything like that before. And dealing with that is a very, very difficult thing to do. When we started coming back a little bit from that, a lot of people started talking about a V-shaped recovery. There was no way it was going to be a V-shape. Okay, it was pretty decent. It was kind of a hockey stick, if you like. And just this last month, finally, in July, we got back to the point where the U.S. economy has more people working than it had on the month before the pandemic started. It took us 27 months to go from the trough back up to where we were just even. 27 months. What does that mean? Well, if you go back and look at the recessions in the post-war era, not counting the 2008 one, the average was 13, 14 months. Okay, so this one took about twice as long. But if you go back to 2008, it took 59 months. So this one's about half the length of that one. And it's pretty remarkable if you think about it, because all those others that took 13 or 14 months, we usually lost 2 million, 4 million jobs. And a really bad one, maybe 4.5, 5 million jobs. We lost 22 million jobs. And so, in that sense, it's been a rapid recovery, not a V shape certainly, but a very rapid recovery. Part of that was because the Federal Reserve put a whole lot of liquidity into the economy, trillions and trillions of dollars. Part of it was because we passed all those stimulus packages and ran up the deficit by about $7 trillion more than it already was. Now, those of you who've been around and heard me before know over the years I've been fairly critical of the federal government for the way it's managed its finances and has not really done what it should have in terms of trying to not necessarily balance the budget, but get some sort of reasonable balance to it. A friend of mine who was a very good politician who's retired now once told me that the difference between Republicans and Democrats was they'd both spend everything you gave them and then some, but the Republicans would feel bad about it. In the last 10 or 15 years, frankly, they haven't even felt bad about it. I mean, when the Democrats were in control, they would pass massive spending bills with no offsetting revenue. When Republicans were in control, they would pass massive tax cut bills with no offsetting revenue reduction. So, I mean, both sides, they play it from different sides of the balance sheet, but both sides have been increasing the deficits. And my problem was not the $7 trillion during the pandemic. My problem was the $1 trillion a year during the 11 years of growth. But during the pandemic, I really think we had to do this. We knew it would lead to some inflation. We knew it would lead to some problems down the road. But literally, the country was faced with people, well-run small businesses that have been in a family for generations, suddenly having no revenue for 7 or 8 months. Families where you have a job and you kind of live paycheck to paycheck, but you've been getting along just fine, taking care of your family, taking care of your kids. All of a sudden, you have no income for 6 or 7 months. I mean, it was a devastating situation we had to address. We didn't do it perfectly. I mean, they sent some checks to dead people. There's a lot of things coming out now about some of the fraud that went into it. Some people got money they didn't need. But on the whole, we had to do something, and we did. The way I've described it is we had our choice. We had two choices. We had a choice of spending a whole lot of money and run the deficit. That's what I would call a terrible choice. The other one we had was not do that. That's what I would call a catastrophic choice under the circumstances. So fortunately, we chose the terrible one. Again, there was not a good one that we missed or something. Those were the two options available, and we availed ourselves of the least bad of the two. But that doesn't come without consequences, and we're seeing some of those consequences right now. And that's kind of where I want to just give you a little bit of preamble to kind of take you into where we are. What I'm going to try to do is talk about some of these issues that have people confused right now and worried right now. And we'll talk about the supply chain, inflation, the workforce, immigration. Like I say, I'm not going to dodge anything, and climate and energy and all those things. And try to give you a little bit of perspective. The new bill that was just passed, I'll address that to some extent as well. So again, I'm going to try to just pull back the onion a little bit, make it a little easier to understand. Doesn't really matter where you start; they're mostly interrelated with one another. Let's start with the supply chain, and try to think about it this way. Try to imagine in your mind the biggest engine that you can possibly imagine. Huge engine, okay? In fact, think of it as a $100 trillion engine, because that's about how much output the world economy generates every year. We generate about 20 trillion of it in this country, but about a $100 trillion engine. And it's been purring along pretty well for a decade. Occasionally it needs an oil change, maybe a little grease here and there, but it's doing just fine. It's purring along, and there's no reason to think it won't keep purring along if you take care of it. And then all of a sudden you stop it, dead in its tracks. And I don't mean by tapping on the brake. I mean by turning off the key and jumping out and letting it run into a tree. And then you go over and you take some sledgehammers and you just bang on it for a while. Just beat it up really good. And then you just let it sit out in the elements. The kind of heat and cold weather we've been having around the country lately. We just let it sit out in the elements for 6 or 8 months. And then you act like you're going to restart it, but you just barely get it going. Then you run into another tree and do the same thing all over again. And then you're ready to start it back up again. As you can imagine, that's not going to be a smooth start. And that's exactly what we faced with the supply chain. We had basically halted the world economy. We basically had to shut it down with the pandemic, and then had fits and starts and trying to restart it and this and that, and then the pandemic would raise its head again. And then we finally got to a point where we said, okay, we're ready to go now. And that didn't mean that automatically every factory would be up and running at full production, that every worker would be back on the job, that every way of transporting things would be back and working smoothly. Those things are hard to do. It's a very, very big engine, and it's hard to get all those parts working together at the same time. And that's what created the supply chain situation that we had, was simply trying to restart this enormous engine. And we faced some headwinds along the way. With that, at first we couldn't get the chips into the ports, and then we couldn't get the stuff from the ports onto the trucks, and we had shortages of things because you can't gear up all the production automatically overnight. We had some random things happen. There's about 3 major big chip plants in the world that produce most of the chips we use in cars and washing machines and refrigerators and things like that. One of them had a massive fire in the middle of this. We could have rolled with that if everything else was going along fine, but you layered into the pandemic and it becomes a big problem. We had some difficulties with some of the refineries gearing back up. They were offline. We didn't have the capacity. It took the oil and gas industry a while to get back up. And then to top it all off, we had the invasion of Russia entering Ukraine. All of that created a situation in energy markets that created some supply chain and some inflation issues. And, a number of things happening. China had another outbreak of COVID, basically shut their economy down. We get a lot of stuff from China, not only consumer goods, but also the inputs to other goods. And so all of these things happened at pretty much in a very short period of time as we're trying to get out of this mess. And so that's why the supply chain situation got to the point it did. It is getting better. It's not perfect by any means. It's going to take a while for it to be perfect, but it is getting better, and we're seeing signs of that all the time. Interestingly, back in the first quarter, we had the negative GDP in the first quarter, and that caused a lot of headlines of everybody being concerned about the economy and that sort of thing. If you go back and look at those numbers, that entire quarter of downturn was because imports went up. The way we do GNP accounting, imports are something that are consumed over here but made somewhere else, so they're negative when you do the accounting. It's a subtraction. The fact that we got more imports in simply meant we were unloading more boats. That's a good thing. We were getting the things out of the water and into the port because they don't become imports until they're here and somebody signs for them and fills out some paperwork. So what that really said was we're making progress on one part of the economy, but the statistics, if you didn't look beyond that first layer, made it look bad. Now, again, this is an ongoing process. We still have some headwinds, but it is getting better. We're seeing that all the time with more and more things. It's a little easier to find some things than it was. We're getting a few, more chips in. There's more. The used car market's not quite as robust as it was a while ago. We're now able to build some houses because we can get the lumber and the steel where it needs to be that we couldn't for a while. You're beginning to see signs of that getting better, but we still have some issues to deal with. That leads me to sort of naturally to the next one, which I think is the one that's occupied most people's minds the most lately, and that's inflation. Everybody's talking about it right now, and there's a lot to break down there. But let me kind of start at the basics. If you've ever had to endure an economics class, and if you do, I know Michelle said she had to do one. You have my sincere apologies because those things can be pretty boring at times. But basically, the thing they tell you about inflation, it's a decent man on the street definition, is that it's too much money chasing too few goods. And we had both of those things happening as we came out of this situation. We had too few goods. That was a supply chain issue I just talked about. We simply weren't getting all the things we needed. We also had too much money. And the reason for that was we did have all of these stimulus packages and all this money the Federal Reserve put in the economy. We had these trillions and trillions of dollars. Some of it went to feed families and keep small businesses alive and did the things we like for it to do. But the government can't go door to door and figure out how much money each person needs. And so they just write formulas. And for example, you may have gotten a child care check every month that you didn't need, and you were cooped up, you couldn't go do anything. So people were accumulating a lot of extra money. And then all of a sudden, you say, okay, now you can go out and start spending money again. So you've been cooped up for a year and a half, 2 years. You have a little extra money. They kind of ring the bell and tell you can go out and do something now. You run out and spend the money. And so that was what basically the sort of big picture of what it was too much money chasing too few goods. We have pretty much dissipated that. People's credit card debt's going up again now. We basically dissipated that too much money now. People have reacted to the higher prices, and we're making progress on the too few goods. The supply chain is getting better. And so we will be seeing inflation come down some in the next few months. We saw it come down just a little bit this month, primarily because of gasoline prices finally coming down some, because we solved some of those earlier issues I was talking about. And I think you can see that continue to happen. I do think long-term inflation will be a little higher than it was before, because the Federal Reserve did balloon up its balance sheet so much. It will correct it some with all these rate increases we're seeing now, with ratcheting back how much they put out in bonds every month and that sort of thing. But they're not going to get it all the way back to where it was. So there's going to be more money in circulation long-term than there would have been otherwise. But what that means is, instead of the 1.5% to 2% we'd had for the previous 10 or 15 years, it'll probably settle out to somewhere where it's averaging around 2.5%, something like that. Not anything to be overly concerned about, but I do think we'll have a little bit higher long-term inflation. But the short-term inflation, there's not a lot of good news I can give you about it. The one piece of good news I can give you is it's all temporary things that get fixed over time. And we're in the process of fixing those now. And I think over the coming months, you'll see some of the numbers show that. That's a very different situation. Everybody wants to compare this to 40 years ago and say the highest inflation in 40 years. It is. It's the highest inflation in 40 years, but it's not the same situation that we had 40 years ago. And I have an ability to speak about that to some extent. Number one, despite my youthful, rugged appearance, I was around 40 years ago, and I was working in these areas 40, 45 years ago. And frankly, I was a little bitty baby economist back then, but I got pulled into this thing in a very strange way. Part of my dissertation back at Rice, back in the mid-'70s, was a big model of the global monetary sector, particularly the U.S. monetary sector, major emphasis. And at that point in time, there wasn't a lot of modeling going on. There were 2 or 3 out there, and mine was a little bigger than theirs. But now you can probably get them for 2 for $15 delivered tomorrow on Amazon or something. But back then, they were pretty rare commodities. And when President Carter lost the election, President Reagan became president, and Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve and was given the mandate to fix inflation, I had the biggest model. And so I was just a kid. I was still in my 20s, but I got pulled into that situation. And don't get me wrong, they didn't let me make any decisions. They never asked my opinion, but they used my numbers. And so I was sort of in the room when a lot of this was happening. And to quote Hamilton, and I can tell you it was a very, very different situation. And if any of you out there in my generation, you'll remember this. I'll give you just a couple of simple examples. If you walked in a bank back then and you wanted to open just a savings account, not even a CD, just a plain old savings account, you would get 5% interest. If you went to a savings and loan, you get 5.25% interest. If you went to a brokerage place, they might pay you 6 or 7% interest. And this is for money you can draw anytime. We're not seeing anything like that right now. Government contracts and many private contracts back in those days had 30-day inflation escalation clauses. So what I'm trying to say is we had institutionalized inflation. We had built it into the system. If banks' basic cost of funds is 5.5%, that means regular interest rates are going to have to be 7, 8%, and you start building up and ratcheting that thing up. We got rid of all that, and we haven't brought it back. And so the good news about this one is it is, except for the small piece I mentioned a moment ago, it's not institutionalized. It's a short-term temporary thing. Short-term, unfortunately, means several months, but it's not the sort of thing that's built into the system where you have to go break it and fix it again in order for inflation to get back under control. The other one I want to talk about for a few minutes, or several others, but one that'll lead into some others, I think, is the workforce. For most companies right now, finding good workers is the biggest problem they're facing. And this one is a little bit different than the others in that I mentioned on the other two, I said, the supply chain, we're in the process of fixing it. This thing works itself out. With inflation, same thing. Unfortunately, I can't say that about the workforce. We have a chronic long-term workforce shortage, and it is driven primarily by demographics. the fact that the baby boomers are retiring and the younger generation is not coming into the workforce as quickly. And this pattern is going to be with us for 10 or 15 years. Now, there's some things we can do about it, and I want to talk about those. But everybody talks now about the 10.5, 11 million job openings that we have. Now, that's the most we've ever had, and that's a true statement, 100%. What they forget to tell you is, before the pandemic, we had a little over 8 million job openings. That was the all-time record at the time. If we'd never had a pandemic, we'd be somewhere around 9 now, just based on what was happening at that point in time. We'd be around 9 million. We're at 10.5 or so. So yes, part of it is pandemic related, but it's a small piece of a bigger problem. This was not something that was, quote, caused by the pandemic. Everyone talks about the great resignation. People are leaving the workforce in droves, and if you listen to some of the commentators, nobody's ever going to work again. That's really not what's happening. Some people did leave their jobs to get a better job, and the statistics show most of them did. But on the whole, the workforce participation rate, the percentage of the working age population that participates in the workforce, was 63% roughly the month before the pandemic. It's a little over 62% right now. So it's dropped about 1%. That's your great resignation. That's all the people dropping out of the workforce. Now, the workforce is about 150 million people. So 1% is 1.5 million. That gets you from 9 to 10.5. I mean, that's, again, there is some of that. And some of those people may not come back to the workforce. But we would have a workforce shortage. It would be our biggest problem we were trying to deal with long term if the pandemic had never happened. It just added a little bit more grist to the mill, so to speak, and made it a little bit more difficult to deal with. How we will deal with it, you know, there's a lot of different ways. I think we'll do things to encourage more people to work. We're already doing that. Make daycare easier for people to get. Some people, big companies, provide it in their workplace. Parent care, because a lot of these folks that are in the workforce now are kind of in that sandwich generation. They have older parents, they have kids, that they need help on both ends of the spectrum. Flexible work hours, flexible work routines, where you can work part of the time at home, kind of a hybrid thing. That's become something of a trend. But trying to coax retirees back to work part-time or to come back as consultants, all of those kind of things will happen and are happening right now. And so that's one way that we'll go about trying to fix this. And I think there's some possibilities there, because if you look at the history of the workforce participation rate, for a very, very long time, most of the last century, or most of the first half of the last century at least, it was right around just a little over 50% participation rate, because almost all men worked and almost no women worked in the workforce. And so it was just a little over 50% most of the time. Beginning particularly in a little bit in the late 50s, particularly in the 60s and 70s, as women entered the workforce in big numbers, it moved up to a little over 70%. And that was kind of the peak. It got to 70% in 2000. That was a little over 70%. That was the highest number that we'd seen, was around the year 2000, around 70%. And that was a lot of women coming into the workplace, a few more men dropping out, frankly. And since then, it's been on a downward trend. And it's down, as I say, to about 62% right now, 63% before the pandemic. But what that tells us is there's 6 or 7% of the workforce out there that might be coaxed back. There was a point in time when that group was in the workforce working, and for a variety of reasons has chosen not to be there now. So all of that to say, there is something to be gained there from making it easier for people to work. And you're seeing a lot of companies investing in that right now. And I think you'll continue to see that. Another thing that we're going to see a lot of is people trying to replace people with technology. Self-checkout at the grocery store is a good example. You need fewer workers in the place if more people go through the little self-check and check themselves out. Those kinds of things. And you're seeing those kinds of technologies, a lot of the automation, the robotics that goes into some of the factories. And the interesting thing about that is I think it can help some in the short term. For example, a classic example is the auto industry. Politicians campaign on the fact that the U.S. has lost the auto industry. That's simply not true. We produce more cars today as a percentage of the world economy. Our market share has gone up. We produce twice as many cars as we did back in the heyday, so-called heyday of the car industry. The difference is we do it with only about half as many workers as we did before, because we've replaced them with automation. And so we haven't lost the industry. It's just technology has changed the industry. Now, the reason I say that's a temporary solution is over the long term, when you have new technology, you create the demand for more labor, not less. You radically change the type of work that's needed. And I think our country probably hasn't done the job, or I know it hasn't done the job we should have in retraining people to meet the new needs. But basically, we have indeed over time created more jobs with technology than we have without. And the proof's very simple. Today, we have the most people working we've ever had, and we have the most technology we've ever had. When the wheel was first invented, it got rid of about 75% of all the jobs that existed at the time. And yet the wheel has created more jobs than we can possibly imagine in the intervening 3,500 years. So again, that's a temporary thing that you do that. But over time, technology creates more demand for workers, not less. And we've seen that. Again, I could give you thousands of examples over the course of history. That's the way it works out. But we are seeing that happening to some extent, particularly in very labor-intensive industries like fast food, like grocery stores, things like that. We are seeing more and more of that robotic arms in warehouses, those kinds of things. So that'll be part of it. The other fairly obvious piece of it is immigration. And this is where I know the politics get very, very dicey about immigration. But there's a lot of elements to immigration right now. And the bottom line is we need workers. There are workers in other places that want to come here. It shouldn't be rocket science for the two parties to get together and figure out a way to do that preserves security, preserves the borders and all of that. Right now, I think the immigration problem, or the immigration issue, I should say, has three elements to it. The first one is the folks who are coming from Central America. And honestly, that's not really probably part of our long-term workforce. And honestly, the solutions that are being proposed right now don't work. I mean, we're seeing that over and over again. The walls are not going to work, inspections are not going to work, guns are not going to work. None of that's going to work to stem that problem. The only thing that works on that, and this has been shown again economically, historically, the only thing that works is we have to get those countries back on their feet because they're in the middle of a drought. They're overrun by corruption and gangs. So if you're a parent, just think about yourself. I'm sure a lot of you in this room are parents. I have 5 kids and 5 grandkids. I definitely am in that camp. If your child was facing a situation where they might be killed by a gang, or they might starve to death, or you could walk, even if you had to walk through a desert, you could walk somewhere and maybe give them a better life, you're going to walk. And if they send you back, you're going to walk again. That's an innate part of our very being, a sense of survival. And it doesn't matter if you put up a wall to try to keep us from getting in, or you inspect us to try to keep us from getting in, or you hold a gun on us and try to keep us from getting in. It's not going to matter. I mean, you're talking about the survival of your children. So I think that one we have to address from a different perspective than what we're looking at. The second one is the immigration that normally comes across the borders, primarily if you live in the Southwest, primarily from Mexico. And in that case, it's simply a case of we need those workers. Roughly about 25% of the construction workforce in the United States today is undocumented, even more in the border states, about 40% in Texas. About 25% of the hospitality workforce in the country is undocumented. Construction, agriculture, just across the board, there's major industries that literally do not have enough workers otherwise. What that says is we need to figure out a way to bring those folks into the country legally, not have them go through what they go through now and suffocate in boxcars and all that, not have the employers be under the risk of a raid and arrest and fines every time they're using workers when they have no choice. That's the only workers they can get. And so, I mean, that's the situation. And then the other piece of it is legal immigration. And again, people don't realize this, but 20% of our doctors are immigrants. Another 20% of our other healthcare workers are immigrants. All the scientists and engineers that we're so proud of, over 20% of those are immigrants. At every level of the workforce, we need more people. Yet we've cut legal immigration by 75% in the last 5 years, and both parties have all of a sudden decided it's a bad thing, despite the fact that as it says in Hamilton, immigrants, we get the job done. Most of us do have a background where we came to this country at some point in time through the immigration process. And back in our families, not too many generations in most cases. But in any case, that is one thing we need to do. And I think we will ultimately have immigration reform, because I think we will demand it, because we're not going to have any choice, because we're going to have more workers than we have now. And that's a logical way to get it. Obviously, investing in education and literacy and those kinds of things can bring more workers on a long-term basis, but they can't really deal too much with the short-term problem. But that one's going to be with us. But there are things we can do to make it not quite as bad as it was. And now I want to spend a couple of minutes now talking about are we in a recession? What's all that about? The new bill and how that relates to climate and energy and those kinds of things, and kind of focus on some of those things for a few minutes. I do want to leave some time for questions. I just looked at my watch here, and I do have a couple of long-term trends I want to talk about. So I think I have a few more minutes. I can still leave some question time. So let me focus on a couple of things here. First of all, are we in a recession today? I don't think so. We've had 2 quarters of GDP decline. That is a man on the street definition of a recession. It's not any type of official definition. As I mentioned, the first quarter was literally because we were unloading boats. I mean, that was a good thing. The second quarter was partially that, and partially some more fundamental things. Inflation got higher and that sort of thing. There were some issues in there, but consumption was still going up. But the bottom line is we've averaged about 400,000 jobs a month being created in the United States this year, 528,000 last month. You don't create 10 or 11,000 jobs a day in an economy that's in a recession. Now, is that going to slow down some? Of course it is. I mean, that puts us gaining 4 or 5 million jobs a year. Historically, even in our good year, we've gained 1.5 million, 2 million jobs. We're not going to keep this pace going forever. Again, there's not enough workers to keep this pace going forever. But I do think we do have sustainability in the sense of being able to avoid a real downturn in the labor market or something of that nature that's going to be severe and lasting a length of time. So I don't think we're in a recession. The bill that was just passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, I always love how they name these things. One side is telling you it's the worst thing that ever happened. My goodness, it's going to destroy us. It's going to make inflation worse. It's just terrible. It's going to destroy jobs. The other side's saying, man, this is great. It's going to stop inflation. It's going to make us grow. It's going to do all these other things. And the bottom line is it's not going to do any of that. Both sides have a little grain of truth in what they say and a whole lot of hyperbole. And that's what you normally expect in the political process. But first of all, this bill came out of a compromise that you really had to work back and forth with a whole lot of folks from the far left and the middle to get it done. So it was not any type of far-reaching bill in either direction. It was fairly limited. It does, if all the accounting works out right, and there's some question about that, but if it does, they talk about it would reduce the deficit by $300 billion. Keep in mind, that's over 10 years. We run $1 trillion deficits every year. You're talking about taking $30 billion a year out of it. We have a $20 trillion economy. You're talking about taking $30 billion out of it. That's less than 0.2%. I mean, it's not a big enough bill, although everybody's calling it enormous. It's not a big enough bill to move the needle in any direction, really. Some of the climate things that were passed will probably be helpful. I'm going to spend a few minutes on that in just a second here, because it does incentivize some things that will hopefully help to reduce emissions and hopefully help us deal with climate change to some extent. But it didn't ban oil and gas drilling. In fact, it increases oil and gas drilling incentives a little bit, and I think that's actually a positive thing, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second here as well. But it didn't do all the radical things you sometimes hear people say that it would do. It will lower healthcare costs some, and it will make more people eligible for some benefits in healthcare, and that's a crisis in many parts of the country. So that is also something that potentially has a little bit of benefit. Long term, if you model it out, it could reduce inflation a fraction of 1/10 of 1% in terms of long-term inflation. It's not going to affect inflation in the next 2 or 3 months. Now, inflation is probably going to go down a little bit in the next 2 or 3 months, and you'll hear a whole lot of politicians claiming credit for it. But it's the forces that were already in motion. The Federal Reserve actions with interest rates, the working out some things in the gasoline market, people responding to higher prices and higher interest rates in the marketplace. All of those things are what's going to bring inflation down a little bit. But you'll definitely see some people trying to claim it's this. If it happens to tick up 1 month, you'll see the other side saying, "Oh man, this bill caused a problem." It these kind of bills don't work that quickly. Again, it's stretched out over a long period of time. There's some positive things and some things I would have liked to see done differently as well, but it's not big enough in an economy the size of ours to move any short-term needles in a major way. So from that, I would say if you were worried about that, go ahead and go to the beach. You got a few weeks of summer left to take advantage of it. That does bring me to a little bit about climate and energy, and being in Texas especially, and living in West Texas, in the middle of the Permian Basin, where the largest oil producing region in the country and probably in the world at this point in time. I get a lot. I'm involved a lot in the energy industry and the whole climate issue. And we have done very deep dives on it with our group. Let me posit a few things for you. First of all, climate change is very real. The science is very real. It is happening, and it is something that has to be addressed. Very important. Secondly, if you look at even the Department of Energy's own projections, we cannot meet the world's energy needs going forward without fossil fuels. Even if you take the Department of Energy's projections for 2050, you need 30% more oil and 30% more natural gas than you need now. You simply can't get there. And there's billions of people in the world in abject poverty, and we can't get them out of poverty without adequate energy supplies. So we need that energy. We have a responsibility to produce it cleaner and better and capture the carbon and use all those new technologies, and we will and we are. But we're going to need a lot of energy to do the things we're going to do. Also, 5G technology and what that looks like it's going to do to the transportation systems and the communication systems is also going to be very energy intensive going forward, perhaps even more than we anticipated. And so you have that situation as well. but the bottom line is we are going to produce hydrocarbons. We're going to have to do it in a much more responsible way and burn them in a much more responsible way as we also explode the growth of renewable sources of energy, of hydrogen, of wind, of solar, of all those things. We need all of that. But even with all of that growing 600%, we still have to have more oil and gas because it's such a small piece of everything that we do now. And so that's the reality of that situation. You hear in Washington, you hear, all the things about getting rid of fossil fuels and that sort of thing. But when it comes right down to it, they don't, because they know they can't. And I think this recent situation has probably put a more emphasis on that as well. So you'll hear a lot about that, but that's not the ultimate solution. But treating those resources in a very different way is a part of the solution. Final thing I want to talk about before I open this up for questions, and I want to have at least 10 or 15 minutes left for questions. Normally it'll be more like 10 than 15, but I'll do the best I can. And if somebody wants to say a little longer than 11, I don't turn into a pumpkin at 11 in the central time zone where I am. I hope you don't either if we want to go a little longer. But the final thing I want to talk about was some long-term issues, because hopefully I've given you a little bit more clarity about all the mess that's going on right now and all the confusion and tried to give you some perspectives. But when you step back a few steps from where we are right now, and you say, what drives economies in the long term? What's really going to determine where we're going to be in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years? Most of the stuff we've read about right now doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter if Elon Musk buys Twitter or not. I mean, it really doesn't in the grand scheme of things when you look at the future. A lot of these things we focus on a lot really don't matter. When you get down to what really drives our long-term future, it's really three things. One of them is the trade and cost patterns in the world. And the pandemic didn't change those a whole lot. It's still cheaper to make a whole lot of stuff in other places. We're still going to do most of the innovating here. But what did happen was we have seen that as companies have started the so-called ESG movement, environmental and social governance, where they look at things beyond the quarterly statement, which is really just a way to say we need to maximize longer-term profits, not just short-term profits, by making sure we're sustainable. As people look at that, they say all of a sudden, it makes sense to get some of our chips somewhere else, because, we don't want all our chips to be on boats and maybe have a fire in one place, and that means we can't get cars or refrigerators or washing machines. We don't want that. We don't need that. We hadn't had any significant investment in chips in this country in the last 15 years. In the last few months, we've had over a $30 billion announcement from Texas Instruments, an $18 billion announcement from Samsung, a $20 billion announcement from Intel, all to build chip plants in the United States. Congress recently passed an act to encourage more chip plant development. We're seeing others are on the drawing board. That's a response to this pandemic, and it will be the other big area we're seeing it is medical equipment. I think people are shocked at how much of our stuff comes from other parts of the world when we're confronted with that. We're seeing the so-called reshoring movement now. And again, we're still going to buy a lot of stuff over there. It's still going to be cheaper, and markets are going to work, and we're going to buy plenty of stuff from other places, as we should in this big integrated global economy of ours. But we're also going to be looking at it from a more sustainability standpoint of having some of those supplies available to us here. And I think that's a positive development that's probably going to lead to a little more long-term growth than we would have had otherwise. The second one that really drives economies is technology. And we have certainly seen examples of that in recent years. It's probably difficult for all of you to imagine, but you did not own a smartphone 15 years ago. Today, they rule every aspect of our lives, but it's a very, very new invention. These kind of meetings that we're having right now were exceedingly rare 3 years ago. You could do it, but everybody on every end had to have technology that wasn't generally available, and it was complicated. But now it's commonplace. Those kind of things. I mean, technology moves very quickly. 5G has some enormous implications. Some of the healthcare research that's going on right now has enormous implications for our future. And in many other areas, smart materials, there's many other areas where we're seeing that. And the pandemic created more needs and made us recognize how much we need a lot of this technology. And when you create more needs, you create more impetus for people to meet those needs, because that's one of the nice things about markets. The moment you realize you have a need, you create the incentive to solve the problem, because you told somebody there's profit to be made if you can solve this problem. And the final one, and I talked about it a little bit before, but the final one that really drives things is demographics. I mean, it's a boring subject. I mean, it's the science of how many people are born, how many people die, and where they move in between. But it is fundamental to economic growth. Our great expansions we had in the 50s and 60s were the result of a rapidly growing workforce. It was a big, huge part of that. Right now, what we're facing is the baby boomers aging out of the workforce. And different generations have different proclivities of when they enter the workforce and how they go about it and those kinds of things. And so demographics, and it's the one we can't control a whole lot. We can make some policies, we can do some things that make the situation better. We don't really control demographics. And to let you know again that this is a longer term problem, when the census came out, 2020, there were 1 million fewer people under the age of 18 in the United States in 2020 than there were in 2010. So this is not something that's going to go away on its own. Okay, it's pretty significant. Having said all of that, I think our future as an economy, we're going to see some slowdown in growth around now, but I think our long-term future is quite good, because I think we are a leader in global trade. We are clearly the leader in innovation and technology. We hold most of the world's fundamental patents. We're on the cutting edge of all of those things. And we will do the kinds of things we have to do to cope with the demographics. So I say all those things to say I think we have a very good long-term future ahead of us. I hope I've helped to clarify a few things for you today. And in the time we have remaining, I'll be happy to entertain questions. I think Michelle's got them where she can read them and send them out to me, and I'll answer as many of them as we have time to answer. So with that, Michelle, I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. We did have a couple of questions in the chat, but if you have more, please put them in there. And if we don't have time for them, then I'll send them on to Dr. Perryman, and he can get with you on those answers. One of the questions that we had was, what effect did closing the pipeline have on inflation? You kind of talked about some of that a little bit. But.
Closing the pipeline. I'm not sure which pipeline we're talking about. Are we talking? I will say one thing I can say, because there's been a lot of issues with pipelines. One of the issues Washington has right now is they have been very, very reluctant to approve the development of more of what's called the midstream infrastructure, what gets the oil from the oil field to the port, and that's mainly pipelines. So if that's the pipelines we're talking about, for example, Keystone XL was one I was involved in directly. That made all the sense in the world economically. But right now it's very difficult. I mentioned the Permian Basin. It's very difficult to get new pipelines to bring oil from the Permian Basin to the Gulf of Mexico, where it can be shipped out and refined and compressed into LNG and shipped around the world. And and that sort of thing. So one of the areas we're going to have to deal with in the future is we're going to have the infrastructure to deal with allowing the energy industry to do what it needs to do. Now, again, it needs to be done responsibly. It needs to be done within mind what our ultimate goals are here, but it needs to be done. And if I could add just one more thought on that, that's a little beyond the question. 10 years ago or so, virtually every LNG plant in the country, we did the economics for the permits with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We've done it, and most of the ones in Canada as well. We've done most of those, Alaska and all over the place. 10 years ago, when we first started seeing that technology, we could basically compress natural gas into a liquid and you can ship it around the world. It changes the natural gas market from a local market to a national market, or I'm sorry, to a global market. I told Congress 10 years ago, if they would really encourage the development of this, we could make Vladimir Putin irrelevant, because the source of his economic power is not his oil. Yeah, it's important short term. We got plenty of places that can produce that much oil. Texas could replace probably 30–40% of it, and other places around the world as well. The key to his power is he controls the natural gas supplies to Eastern and Western Europe. Parts of that area get really, really cold in the winter. And I mean, that's the source of his power. That's if we could get to the point where we could provide an alternative source of power, and we're trying to do that now, but we don't have the scale yet. That could really have some very, very significant and very positive geopolitical implications. And that's just one of several examples I could give you of other places around the world as well. That's just the one that's in the news right now. But we really do have to develop the infrastructure to support the industry. And I hope that's the type of pipeline your question was about. If not, if you'll put it in the chat again, I'll take another run at it.
Okay, I'll see if they add anything else to that. Another question, which you may or not be able to answer, is what companies or at least industries would you invest in for the long term?
Okay. Well, first of all, I would say I am not an investment advisor. Okay, let me start with that. So I'm not giving you any kind of professional investment advice here at all. I'm not going to name companies. Frankly, as you mentioned at the beginning, most of the big companies around are my clients, and I have inside information about most of them. So I'm certainly not going to tell you anything about companies. I will say that, as I said, I believe the long-term future of, basically, if you look at the price of a stock, what it reflects is, what we'll tell you in a textbook is, it's the present discounted value of the future earning stream, appropriately discounted for risk based on all the knowledge currently available. That's the time of technical definition. I would add to that whatever random things going on that day in the news, because if Musk is buying Twitter or not buying Twitter, that can move stuff around, But long term, that's what it is. I believe the United States has a very good economic future. Consequently, I believe our companies will have very good long-term economic returns. As far as investment, it's going to be the ones that meet needs in cutting-edge ways. It's going to be the people in communications, the people in transportation, the people in health and bioscience that are really doing cutting-edge things that have real-world applications that solve problems. And there's a lot of great American companies in those fields that are doing those things. And if I were looking to a place to invest, I would do my homework and find me companies in those areas that are doing some really good things, and that's where I would put my money.
Great answer. Okay, how is cryptocurrency affecting the economy?
Quite a bit, actually. That's a good question. How's cryptocurrency affecting the economy? It is here to stay. It is now a part of the economy. That's not going to change. Many central governments are now looking at digital currencies and that sort of thing, and we're seeing that type of thing. However, it is not, and you hear this a lot, it is not going to replace traditional government fiat type money. For something to replace dollar and yen and yuan and pound and euro, for something to replace those currencies, we have to meet three criteria. You have to be able to express prices. We call it a measure of value. Express prices in those terms. You can kind of do that a little bit, but most crypto things they're still expressed in terms of dollars. But you can kind of do that. It can be a medium of exchange. People accept it for payment. A lot of people now accept cryptocurrency, so it can do that to some extent. But that third thing money has to be is what we call a store of value. And I will pose a question to you right now just to think about. Obviously, you can't answer it for me. But if you were thinking, okay, I'm going to retire in 30 years, I'm going to invest money today, and that's the money I'm going to have for my retirement in 30 years, would you put that money in cryptocurrency today and never look at it again? I think the answer is probably no. As long as the answer is no, it cannot become, a type of money. Now, it's going to do a lot of things. It's going to help a lot of folks who don't have access to the banks. It's going to create an alternative for a lot of people. It's going to generate some technologies that are beneficial. It's also going to consume a lot of electricity, because the way they set those things up, the further out, each of the cryptocurrency systems has a fixed supply, and it gets more energy intensive to get them out the longer you go. Like, we've got most of the Bitcoins out now, but it's going to be decades and decades before we get all of them, because the longer you go, the more power they consume. They're going to consume a lot of power. That's going to put some pressure on some things. But basically, yes, they're here to stay. They're going to be a part of the economy. But no, they're not going to replace the exchange system that we're all accustomed to.
Okay, that's good. So there was a question about how, if there's a place for them to get copies of this data.
Okay. I mean, as you could tell, I was not looking at notes. I did not have reams of data in front of me. Unfortunately, I work on this stuff all the time, so I carry a lot of it around in my head. There are very good sources of just economic data out there. One of the very best ones is the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis has a system called FRED. It's a Federal Reserve data system, and they can give you graph spreadsheets or anything, basically any data series you want. It's a very good system. I wish we'd had it 45 years ago when I started building economic models, but we had to go Xerox it and keep punching in on punch cards, but from dusty government publications. But in any case, as far as our stuff is concerned, obviously we have subscriptions you can buy and that sort of thing. But we have a website that has a lot of stuff posted on it. My weekly column that was mentioned, you can just sign up. That's in a bunch of newspapers, but you can just sign up on the website and get that free. I mean, it's available. Anybody that wants it, we ship it. We send it out to thousands and thousands of people every week. So in addition to the circulation in the papers, which is something like, I think, 40, 50 million people. So, but you can, you can get that and get on that list, and you'll get some of our stuff. And again, if you want to buy some of our stuff, we're happy to sell it to you. But there's a lot of stuff on the website that I think you'd find useful. A lot of our past studies and that type of thing as well, that I think that you would find useful, that we just have out there for people to download.
Okay. All right. I think.
Oh, and I guess I should add to that. It's Perryman. It's PerrymanGroup.com. Okay, it's the website, and you're welcome to go there and mess around and find whatever you want to find.
Awesome. Thank you. If any other questions come through, I will send that to you. But in the meantime, thank you so much for doing this for us. It was really enlightening and helpful. And if our attendees have other questions, they can find you at PerrymanGroup.com as well.
Yeah, if you get on the website, there's a way to email us from the website. So you can do that as well.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time. Everybody stay safe, and thank you again, Dr. Perryman. It was wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you.